Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We are listening to most disturbing cases you've ever heard. Enjoy.
For 3 decades, the murder of Timothy Coggins left both his family and community in the grips of fear and uncertainty. On October 9th, 1983, hunters discovered his body next to a giant oak tree in an open field. It was obvious to investigators that he'd been murdered. Despite promising leads and the discovery of possible suspects, the investigation came to a screeching halt. The Coggins family suffered in silence until a new team of investigators took it upon themselves to find justice for Timothy. But little did any of them realize just how deep the festering wound of corruption truly ran. Spalding County is part of the west central portion of Georgia. It has a little bit of everything: small town charm, natural beauty, and vibrant culture. Home to beautiful lakes, acres of scenic parks, and several historical landmarks, Spalding County welcomes each and everyone to its doorstep. However, in the 1980s, life was much different. There was a stark divide between the white and black community, and racial tensions ran high. This was the infamous Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist and terrorism group, operated one of their chapters within the community. So, when the beaten body of a young black man was found in Spalding County, it led investigators down a treacherous path that would reopen old wounds. Sunday, October 9th, 1983, was a crisp fall morning. A group of squirrel hunters were making their way through an open field north of the city of Griffin, Georgia. Near a giant oak tree, locally known as the Hanging Tree, the men stumbled upon the body of a black man. It was clear the man had suffered horribly before dying. His face and head were badly beaten and disfigured, his body bruised and bloody. The hunters hurried to contact the authorities. Officers from the Spalding County Sheriff's Department arrived with haste to the horrific crime scene. There, they found the man exactly as described by the hunters. He was partially clothed, with his shirt missing, and his pants and underwear pulled down to his knees. There appeared to be a large X carved into his abdomen. While surveying the scene, officers noted tire tracks throughout the field. Within the grid formed by the tracks, they found a bloodied sweater turned inside out. In several areas around the tire tracks, they noticed patches of blood. Officers surmised that the victim had been dragged behind a vehicle before being left for dead. There was no murder weapon found at the scene. What they did recover was an empty Jack Daniels whiskey bottle and a wooden table leg wrapped in black insulation tape. The bottle, table leg, sweater, and samples of sand were taken into evidence. The body was transported to the coroner's office for further examination. The examiner revealed that the victim was stabbed 7 times in the back and once behind his knee in order to disable him. Defensive wounds were visible on both of his arms, and he was severely bludgeoned in the head by a blunt object, possibly the table leg found at the scene. There were 2 large X's carved into his abdomen and back, which was later revealed to represent the Confederate flag. The examiner determined that the victim died approximately 36 hours before he was found, possibly on Friday, October 7th, 1983. It was found that he had died not from any one specific injury, but rather from blood loss as a result of his cumulative injuries. The severity of his injuries made it difficult for the examiners to identify him. He was estimated to be between his early to mid-20s, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, and had a small tattoo on his hand. Meanwhile, investigators looked through recent missing persons reports and found nothing that matched their victim. With few leads, sheriff's officers turned to patrolman Oscar Jordan to help with the investigation. Jordan had been one of the few black officers in Spalding County. They believed that Jordan could help with the investigation by becoming a liaison between the predominantly white police force and the black community. Officers needed Jordan to establish a connection as racial tensions created mistrust between law enforcement and the black community. Over the next 2 days, Jordan went door to door asking anyone if they recognized the victim from the autopsy photo. It was difficult for people to put a face to the man, as he'd been severely beaten and disfigured. He had all but given up until he reached the Coggins-Dorsey home in Griffin, Georgia. There, he spoke to a young woman named Talisa Coggins. At first, she didn't recognize the badly beaten man in the photo, but on closer inspection, she saw the small tattoo on his hand and told Officer Jordan that the man was her older brother, 23-year-old Timothy Coggins. Timothy Wayne Coggins was born on October 29, 1960, in Griffin, Georgia. He was the fourth of 8 children, 3 brothers and 4 sisters, raised by his mother, Viola, and stepfather, Robert Dorsey. His niece described him as charming, charismatic, and playful, with a bright smile that showcased his beautiful, pearly white teeth. He was well loved in his Griffin community and worked doing odd jobs in and around the area as a handyman. Timothy was not quick to anger and enjoyed the lighter side of life. He shared a close bond with his younger sister, Talisa Coggins, as she was only 2 years younger than him. Timothy took the time to teach his sister how to ride a bike and get around town on her own. He was known for being outgoing and enjoyed a good party with old friends and new ones he'd make along the way. Timothy was also known to be a charmer, particularly around women, and attracted much attention. Timothy was the type of person who never met a stranger. He counted everyone as a friend, new or old. Jordan knew he had to start from the very beginning and interviewed Talisa about the last day she saw Timothy alive. According to Talisa, she and Timothy went out that Friday, October 7th, 1983, to a club called People's Choice in Griffin, Georgia. It was a popular hangout for the young black crowd, and with a fully stocked bar and hot barbecue for sale, it attracted a steady stream of patrons. Not only was Timothy a regular at the club, but he also helped out with odd jobs for the owner, who was a good friend. In recent weeks, though, Timothy had been causing quite a stir. People's Choice was almost exclusively for black clubgoers, but Timothy had been swaying to the music with a young white woman. Though many would not bat an eyelid at the sight these days, in 1980s Georgia, it was gossip fuel. The racial divide was strong, with regular rallies and parades being held by Spalding County's local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. When friends warned Timothy that his fraternizing with the young white woman would cause problems, he allegedly told them there was no way a white man would enter the club. Talisa told Officer Jordan that on that last Friday she saw her brother. She'd overheard a few people saying that 2 white men were waiting for Timothy outside as she made her way to the bathroom. When she came out, she saw her brother again on the dance floor. This time, though, he was not dancing. Instead, he followed a white man out of the club. She never saw him alive again. Jordan asked Talisa why no one had come forward to report Timothy missing. She explained that Timothy regularly disappeared from home for a few days after the weekend. He knew everyone in town and often stayed over with friends. They assumed he was safe somewhere, crashing on someone's couch. That was until officers showed up 2 days later, questioning people about the victim of a gruesome murder. Working with the information given by Talisa, Jordan and other sheriff's officers questioned witnesses from the club who backed up what Talisa had told them. From this, they learned that Timothy left the club with a woman and 2 white men. But no one knew who they were or where they'd gone after that night. The heat of the investigation fizzled slowly, but Officer Jordan kept his ear to the ground for more leads. Losing Timothy was only the beginning of the Coggins family's nightmare. During the investigation, they were constantly harassed by unknown individuals. One of the first incidents was when Timothy's stepfather, Robert, received an anonymous call telling him more family members would be killed if the investigation wasn't dropped. Robert also found a bloody t-shirt in the school bus he was driving, seemingly mocking the evidence found at the crime scene. One night while the family were together watching television, a brick was thrown through the living room window. Scrawled on the brick were the words, "You're next." The next incident terrified them even more. A decapitated black dog was left on the porch of the family home with another note that read, "You're next." Timothy was eventually laid to rest at the Fuller Chapel United Methodist Church Cemetery. However, his family did not put a headstone on his grave, fearing the marker would be desecrated. Fear grew as the family pondered who could be harassing them. Was it the murderers, or others who had rallied behind those responsible for Timothy's death? Months after the murder of Timothy Coggins, Officer Oscar Jordan was still on the case and began hearing rumors of a possible motive for the murder. According to a few leads, Timothy had taken about $600 from a couple of white men in exchange for marijuana, but he never delivered on the drugs and was running scared, fearing they might be after him. Jordan then received another tip about paying a visit to Carey's mobile home park in Sunnyside, near where Timothy's body was discovered. The tipster revealed that there was a man bragging about knowing what had happened to Timothy Coggins. At the trailer park, Jordan met with a woman named Sandra Bunn. Sandra alleged that, on the night Timothy was murdered, she saw him at the trailer park along with 3 other people: her brother, Frankie Gebhardt, his girlfriend, Mickey Guy, and Frankie's brother-in-law, Bill Moore Sr. She went on to tell Jordan that all 4 of them got into a pickup truck and drove in the direction of the hanging tree. Armed with this new information and the names of 3 possible suspects, Officer Oscar Jordan returned to the investigation team and presented his new theories. But as swiftly as he found the proverbial needle in the haystack, the case was taken away from him and reassigned to other investigators. Jordan was let go from the team and returned to patrol duty, while a new team looked into the murder of Timothy. Frankie Gebhardt was called in for questioning as investigators worked with the information gathered by Jordan. During his interview, Frankie provided them with a solid alibi. He was with his girlfriend, Mickey Guy, the entire night. They then called in Mickey, who confirmed Frankie's alibi. According to their statements, they'd never been to the club People's Choice, as it was an exclusively black establishment. They claimed never to have met Timothy Coggins or had any dealings with him in any way. From notes compiled by investigators, none of the witnesses could properly identify the individuals who were last seen with Timothy. Investigators failed to pursue the Bill Moore lead at all. Detectives searched Gebhardt's trailer and found no physical evidence to link him to the crime. According to investigators at the scene, none of the blood found matched either Gebhardt, Guy, or Moore's blood types. DNA testing was still in its infancy, and investigators, it seemed, had closed the investigation despite the glaring suspicion that someone was hiding something. Timothy's death became a footnote in the Spalding County Sheriff Department. The Coggins family continued to grieve, not knowing who to trust as the law failed them. They also feared being victimized by the very people who threatened them with violence after Timothy's death. They lived with this nightmare for over 30 years. Viola Coggins Dorsey, Timothy's mother, was shattered by her son's death and lived with the guilt and torment until her death in February 2016. However, weeks before her death, she made a startling statement. During her lucid moments, Viola would tell her daughter Talisa that the investigators were going to find Timothy's killers. Viola said she would not live to see the day, but she was sure someone was going to find her son's killers.
And even on her dying deathbed, she said she spoke of Tim's name. And so, she still wanted justice for her son, even on her deathbed 33 years later.
Talisa and her family had no expectations. After all these years, no one had contacted them regarding the case. But in a twist of fate, the Coggins family received a call from the district attorney's office in July 2017. They now knew who killed Timothy. In December 2016, Special Agent Jared Coleman received the long-abandoned case file of Timothy Coggins. Over the years, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation handled the major crimes from the more rural regions in the state. The agency cycled the unsolved cases among its agents every 6 months in hopes that a fresh set of eyes would be able to find a clue among the notes. Coleman, who was at the time in his second year at the agency, was struck by the lack of the investigation into Timothy's murder. It also struck him that no one seemed to care about looking into the case in recent years. With the determination to find justice for Timothy, Coleman dug into the file and discovered several pieces of evidence that could help him crack the 3-decade-old cold case. First, he looked at the interview with possible suspects Frankie Gebhardt, Mickey Guy, and Bill Moore Sr. The interviews with Gebhardt and Guy showed too many holes in their stories. The two only had each other for alibis and told the initial investigators they had no links to either Timothy or his subsequent death. To Coleman, the entire interview seemed lacking interest in delving deeper, and he made a note to recheck these people of interest. He also found that the third suspect, Moore, had been completely ignored in the investigation. A further look at the case file revealed a more recent development in the case that was completely overlooked. In 2007, the GBI received a letter from an inmate named Christopher Vaughn, who was serving time after being charged as a pedophile. In his letter, Vaughn alleged that he had information regarding the murder of Timothy Coggins. He was only 10 years old when he and other squirrel hunters discovered his body near the hanging tree in Sunnyside back in 1983. In the file, Coleman discovered interviews carried out by investigators with Vaughn. However, it seemed the investigators did not do much to follow up on the leads and left the case to grow cold again. Determined, Agent Coleman contacted the Spalding County Sheriff's Department and newly elected Sheriff Daryl Dix, who listened to Coleman's theories about the case and believed that, together, they could finally give the Coggins family the answers they needed. For Sheriff Dix, the case was also an opportunity to mend the relationship between the Black community and the Sheriff's Department, given the uneasy history between them. Dix assigned Sheriff's Deputy Mike Morris to Coleman, and together the men revisited the original crime scene.
The oak tree is referred to several times in every case as the tree. It's a place where drug transactions occurred, parties, and Coggins' body was found on the power line.
A look at the area confirmed Coleman's gut feeling. Timothy's death was a lynching. He'd been tortured before being left to die in the open field. Sheriff Dix, meanwhile, began his own investigation and requested the evidence from the crime scene be brought out. Upon examining the evidence, Dix was frustrated to discover that most, if not all the evidence, had been lost. This included the whiskey bottle, the table leg, the bloody sweatshirt, and the tire track impressions from the crime scene. It was either a severe case of mishandling evidence or a serious cover-up by the original investigation team. Determined, Sheriff Dix began looking through cases related to hate crime and racism from the 1980s and discovered the journal of an undercover detective who was trying to infiltrate the Spalding County chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. The journal was dated back to 1982, a year before Timothy's murder. In his notes, the detective described his attempts to join the ranks of the Klan in order to discover the people behind the group. He was eventually inducted into the Klan and was told by one of the members that they had already inducted several high-ranking officials from the Spalding County Sheriff's Department and the Griffin Police Department. It was clear to Sheriff Dix the very people that were supposed to be helping solve the case were, in fact, sabotaging the investigation. It was time to go back and revisit the suspects and witnesses. Coleman and Dix had their theories, and on April 26, 2017, Coleman paid a visit to Christopher Vaughn in prison. Two familiar names kept popping up in Vaughn's testimony, Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore. Vaughn explained that in 1983, he overheard Frankie Gebhardt make a remark about killing a black man while attending a party. As Vaughn got older, Gebhardt constantly brought up the murder of Timothy Coggins and bragged about killing him. Gebhardt also confessed that he'd burned all the evidence linking him to the murder and tossed them down a well on his property. Vaughn was not done yet. He added that, on the night of Timothy's murder, he saw from his bedroom window the three suspects, Gebhardt, Guy, and Moore, with the victim. He stated that he knew of a possible motive for Timothy's murder. According to Vaughn, Gebhardt had been enraged when he discovered that his then-girlfriend, Mickey, had been having an affair. But it wasn't just the affair that had riled him up. It was the fact that she was having an affair with a black man. Upon hearing this, Coleman and his team of investigators believed that Mickey was the very same woman witnesses saw Timothy dancing with on that night. However, they were unable to confirm this because Mickey had moved away from Georgia weeks after the murder, and she passed away in 2010. Investigators didn't give up, though. Although Mickey was out of the picture, they still had two suspects on their list. First, they interviewed Bill Moore Sr. Moore vehemently denied knowing Timothy or being involved with his murder. Coleman knew that Moore was lying to them from the outset. They didn't press him any further, and instead turned their attention to Frankie Gebhardt. Gebhardt was already in custody at the Spalding County Detention Center. The 59-year-old Gebhardt denied any knowledge of Timothy Coggins, and even went as far as to claim he'd never heard of the case. Gebhardt further denied bragging about the killing or disposing of evidence, and challenged investigators to dig up the well if they so pleased. When Coleman showed Gebhardt the picture of Timothy, he flew into a rage, spewing derogatory language and explaining that he'd never seen him before.
The reason we're here is in 1983, there was a body found in North Falls County. A black guy was found. Do you remember the murder? No. But that right, that picture of that guy, though. I didn't know it, baby. I didn't know it. Okay.
Coleman did a bit of digging into Gebhardt's past and discovered that he'd spent his entire life living at or near Carey's mobile home park in Sunnyside. He dropped out of school and took up work as a timber logger. On weekends, he and his brother-in-law, Bill Moore Sr., threw wild parties with drugs and alcohol flowing freely. The two men were considered inseparable by those who knew them, and both had a tendency for violence, often landing themselves at the local courthouse. It's alleged that they once butchered a cow on the kitchen floor of one of their trailers. Given their penchant for violence, linking them to the crime was not so far-fetched. And, as Coleman soon discovered, many people were willing to talk once news spread that investigators were hot on the heels of Timothy's suspected killers. In July 2017, investigators made headlines by announcing the reopening of the Timothy Coggins case following new leads in the investigation. In an interview with reporters, Sheriff Daryl Dix warned the killers and their accomplices that they were coming for them. Over the next few months, between 60 to 70 witnesses came forward, with most, if not all, saying they'd been keeping the secret for almost 34 years. Some accounts varied, and investigators found that Gebhardt allegedly told a few witnesses that he'd intentionally told different people different stories to confuse the investigation. But a few key witnesses stood out. William Sadler, one of the men who was in the hunting group that discovered Timothy's body, stated that not only did Gebhardt confess to murdering Timothy to him in person, but that he himself reported the confession to officers in 1983. However, nothing had ever come from it. Another witness named Shirley Sisk also came forward with a confession about Bill Moore Sr. She'd been a friend of Moore's late wife, Brenda, and told investigators that Brenda once allegedly told her that Moore planned to murder a boy and drag him behind his truck. An ex-girlfriend of Gebhardt's also came forward, claiming that she had endured years of him while they were dating, and he once threatened her that she too would end up like that black boy in the ditch. Another woman, who remained anonymous, came forward alleging both Gebhardt and Moore drunkenly admitted to the murder and lamented the good old days of killing black people for no reason. The investigation team received harsh backlash from family members of the accused as arrest warrants were issued for both men. They insisted that both men were being railroaded by the sheriff's department in an attempt to garner the support of the black community. 41-year-old Brandy Abercrombie, Moore's daughter and Gebhardt's niece, said they'd never heard of this case before. "We have no knowledge of this Timothy Coggins case. I've never heard of this case in my entire life," she told reporters. But for investigators, there was enough circumstantial evidence to bring the two men to justice. However, in a murder trial, much more was still needed to make it an airtight case.
I think it's horrible. It's sad that that would happen. It's interesting to know about the area. I hope they find who done it and justice is served. I really do.
The prosecution still needed evidence that could ultimately link these two men to the crime. Agent Coleman met with attorney Marie Broder and explained the lack of evidence due to mishandling within the sheriff's department. It frustrated the prosecution team because without the lack of proper physical evidence, the jury could turn in the other direction. It was then that Coleman remembered Christopher Vaughn telling them about the well on Gebhardt's property. The problem was, to excavate the well would mean destroying Gebhardt's home. Coleman and Broder shared a dogged determination for finding justice, and in time, they were able to find a hydrovac company in Atlanta that specialized in blasting water into wells and vacuuming up any debris left behind without causing damage to the property. It was worth a shot, and in August 2017, the investigation team were able to dredge up years of trash and a bounty of evidence. In the trash, they found a partially burned size 10 Adidas tennis shoe, similar to what Timothy's family said he usually wore when going out. Then they discovered a white t-shirt that was torn by what appeared to be several stab marks on the back. They already knew Timothy was stabbed 7 times in the back. They also found a thick chain, possibly used to tie and drag Timothy behind the vehicle. The last but most crucial piece of evidence was an old, broken knife. Timothy's sister, Talisa, voiced her concerns over the trial. She believed nothing was guaranteed until a final verdict was passed. Ain't nothing guaranteed. As a black woman, a black human being living in a racist town, you never know what's going to happen, she said.
I was asking the Lord to watch over my siblings. It was just like Tim names that kept spitting out of my mouth. So they put me up, Peggy, Jack, Tyrone, Tim. And I kept saying, well, why am I doing this? I just kept saying Tim name. And it was just like so weird to ask for love, bless him anyway. And I just felt like that's what God was trying to show me because I kept spitting his name out. And it felt good to know that they arrested somebody for Tim's murder.
But before the dust could settle on the new evidence discovered in the well on Gebhardt's property, there was yet another twist in an already sordid case. Following their interview with Gebhardt back in April 2017, investigators placed a wiretap on Gebhardt's calls made from the prison. This was done as they were not getting the information they needed from him willingly. They noticed he'd often called his sister Sandra Bunn. In the recordings, they discovered that Sandra advised Gebhardt against speaking with investigators and how to avoid being caught. She told him to avoid taking anything to drink or eat from investigators in case they were able to collect DNA from his discarded utensils. Sifting through these conversations, they discovered that Sandra had been following the advice of her son, Lamar Bunn, an officer with the Milner Police Department. What confused investigators was that Sandra had initially pointed out the connection between Timothy and Gebhardt, Guy, and Moore. Her intentions were never revealed, but investigators believed it was a show of arrogance that police would never be able to crack the case, despite the suspects staring them in the face. Shockingly, this was not the only twist in the case. There was yet another person who, it seemed, believed that Gebhardt should have a fighting chance against the prosecution. A third person was discovered to be aiding Gebhardt while in custody. A man named Gregory Huffman, who was a Spalding County Corrections officer, had been passing information about the investigation to Gebhardt. These, investigators believed, helped keep Gebhardt one step ahead of the investigation by providing him details he could use in court during his trial to his own advantage. This was more than enough for investigators and prosecutors to finally put an end to the enduring tort faced by the Coggins family. On October 13, 2017, the Spalding County Sheriff's Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation finally arrested Gebhardt and Moore for the murder of Timothy Coggins. Sandra Bunn, Lamar Bunn, and Gregory Huffman were arrested for obstructing justice. Lamar was suspended, awaiting the outcome of his trial, while Huffman was fired. They were all detained at the Spalding County Detention Center. Now that investigators had all their suspects tucked away in jail, they began by recreating the events of the day leading up to Timothy's murder. Investigators believed that Timothy had gone to the People's Choice Club that Friday, October 7, 1983, and invited Mickey Guy along. From what they knew so far, Timothy and Mickey had been familiar with each other. Given the racial tensions in the county, their relationship may have sparked interest and the story ultimately spread to Mickey's then-boyfriend, Gebhard. Upon hearing this, investigators believe that Gebhard and Moore drove to the club and started asking people about Timothy. People admitted to seeing Timothy with a white woman in the club and confessed that it wasn't the first time the two of them had been spotted together. It was a tense situation, and the story began to spread. Gebhard eventually made his way into the club and confronted both Timothy and Mickey. To avoid a confrontation, and given his naturally easygoing manner, Timothy may have agreed to go talk it out with the men. All four made their way to the Cary Mobile Home Park, where Gebhard confronted both Mickey and Timothy about the accusations. They're unsure about what transpired next, but from witness statements, they gather that the two men drove Timothy and Mickey out to the open field near the hanging tree, where they launched a sudden and brutal attack on Timothy by severing his tendons to disable him, and then stabbing him repeatedly in the back. While he was down, they then carved out 2 large X's on his back and abdomen. They then bludgeoned him with a table leg and chained him to the back of the pickup truck before dragging him around the field. Timothy was then left to die, as the other 3 returned to Gebhard's home to dispose of the evidence. Investigators firmly believe that, given Gebhard's string of violence against women and his affiliation with racist groups, he may have been motivated by jealousy in finding Mickey not just in the arms of another man, but a black man. Gebhard and Moore were set to be tried separately for the crime, and in mid-January 2018, Gebhard's trial began. Prosecution Marie Broder began with a passionate opening statement and then walked the jury through the crime scene and the manner in which Timothy was so callously murdered. They relied on witness testimony, as DNA evidence was all but lost. The defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case.
This man makes admissions over the last 34 years, and those details about the crime scene that were never released. You'll hear that.
By pointing out the major number of witnesses were criminals themselves, and that the stories had each been different. Ultimately, another witness pointed out that, as he told investigators previously, Gebhard's aim was to tell different stories to different people to confuse the investigation. Another hole in Gebhard's defense was his inability to stop bragging about the murder. He'd inadvertently pointed investigators to where he'd hidden the evidence from the crime. Although no DNA could be found from the items recovered, the discovery backed up several witness claims. This included Christopher Vaughn's claim that Gebhard told him how he disposed of evidence in a well. In the end, the jury foreman said that it was Gebhard's own boasts that ultimately did him in. He revealed that they'd counted 17 times that Gebhard had admitted to the killing in some way or the other. On June 26, 2018, Gebhard was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and concealing the death of another.
In the Superior Court of Spalding County, State of Georgia versus William Franklin Gebhard, defendant, criminal action number 18R105A. Having considered whether the state has proven each element of the following offenses, we, the jury, unanimously find as follows. Count 1, malice murder, guilty. Count 2, felony murder, guilty. Count 3, aggravated battery, guilty. Count 4, aggravated assault, guilty. Count 5, concealing the death of another, guilty. Signed this 26th day of June 2018, signed by their foreperson.
He was sentenced to life in prison with an additional 30 years. In his sentencing, the judge said to Gebhard, "Hopefully, sir, you have stabbed your last victim." He remains in prison at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Butts County, Georgia. In August 2018, Bill Moore Sr. avoided trial by pleading guilty to concealing the death of another, as well as voluntary manslaughter. He received 20 years in prison, along with 10 more years of probation. Bill remained at the Augusta State Medical Prison until his death in October 2021. As for Sandra, her son Lamar, and Huffman, they each posted bail. Sandra and Lamar posted bail of about $700 each, and Huffman posted bail for $35,000. The latest report suggests that charges against all 3 have not yet been resolved, and there's not been any news on the whereabouts of the 3 individuals since 2018. Although the verdict will not return Timothy to them, the case has somehow been able to heal wounds that would have otherwise gone on to fester had the truth not been uncovered. During the trial, both families spoke on occasion, and after all was said and done, Bill Moore's daughter, Brandy Abercrombie, was overcome with emotion. She apologized to the Coggins family for her family's part in the death of their beloved brother and uncle. As she cried, Talisa Coggins wiped away Brandy's tears and forgave her for not understanding the enormity of the situation. Brandy, Talisa figured, would have been a little girl and have trouble believing her father and uncle could have committed such a crime. After all the stuff that Black people have endured, from slavery up until now, we still are a forgiving people, she said. The Coggins family has finally, after all these years, been able to place a headstone on Timothy's grave without fear of being attacked or having his grave desecrated by those who once victimized him. The inscription reads, "Gone, but never forgotten." Today's case